Power does not reward fairness, it rewards control. Machiavelli understood this when he studied how leaders rise and stay in power. The world is not built on justice, it is built on advantage. Those who follow rules blindly often lose to those who break them without hesitation. In business, politics, and relationships, power decides outcomes more than fairness ever will. Machiavelli's lesson was simple. Be strategic, not moral, if you want to win. Fairness can make you predictable, and predictability is weakness in a competitive world. Ruthlessness, when controlled, becomes a tool for survival and dominance. People respect power more than they respect good intentions. To play fair in an unfair system is to volunteer for defeat. Machiavelli did not teach cruelty for pleasure, but for survival in political reality. Those who understand power do not waste time proving they are nice. They focus on results, influence, and control over situations and people. In this mindset, fairness is optional, but strength is required. The strongest lesson from Machiavelli is that power protects itself. You either learn to navigate power as it is, or become controlled by those who do. Fairness without power always collapses under pressure. That is reality. Fairness is one of the most dangerous illusions in the world of power, because it teaches people to expect rules that others are not following. From the outside, fairness looks like strength, but inside competitive systems it often becomes a quiet form of weakness. Machiavelli understood that most environments where people compete, whether in politics, business, or social influence, are not governed by fairness but by advantage. The moment you assume everyone will play by the same rules, you lower your guard and expose yourself to those who are willing to do what you are not prepared to do. That is where imbalance begins. People who move with strategy instead of fairness see opportunities that others ignore because they are too focused on what is right instead of what is effective. Fairness slows decision-making because it forces you to constantly check whether your actions are morally balanced in a space where others are not doing the same. In that delay, stronger players take position, influence outcomes, and lock in control. Machiavelli's idea was not that fairness is useless in life, but that it cannot be your primary guide when power is involved. When survival or success is on the line, fairness becomes a luxury, not a rule. Those who insist on being fair in every situation often end up predictable, and predictability is the first step toward being controlled. Once people know you will always choose the right option, they begin to structure their moves around that certainty, and they use it against you without hesitation. In this way, fairness becomes something others exploit rather than respect. The world does not naturally reward equal effort. It rewards positioning, timing, and psychological advantage. Machiavelli observed that leaders who survive difficult environments are not the ones who are the most morally consistent, but the ones who understand when to bend expectations in their favor. Fairness can also create emotional decision-making, where you hesitate to act because you are considering how it will look rather than what it will achieve. That hesitation is costly. It creates gaps in control, and in those gaps, others step in. The uncomfortable truth is that many people mistake fairness for strength, but in reality, it often hides fear of taking decisive action. Machiavelli pushes the idea that power respects outcomes, not intentions. If your fairness leads to your loss, then it has failed as a strategy in the context of power. This does not mean becoming reckless or chaotic, but it does mean understanding that not every situation deserves equal treatment or emotional balance. Some situations require cold clarity, fast judgment, and willingness to act without waiting for everything to feel right. Fairness without awareness becomes self-sabotage. The world does not adjust to your principles. You must learn when to apply them and when to set them aside. That is the real difference between those who remain controlled by systems and those who learn to move above them. Power does not respond to good intentions. It responds to pressure, clarity, and consequence. And Machiavelli understood this better than most modern thinkers because he studied real leadership, not theory. When men step into competitive spaces, whether in career, relationships, or social status, They quickly discover that being nice is not the same as being respected. Respect is built when your actions carry weight, when people understand that your decisions are final, and when your presence creates consequences for how others treat you. Ruthlessness, in the Machiavellian sense, is not about cruelty. It is about removing hesitation from your decision-making so that you do not lose control of situations that require firmness. Many men lose opportunities not because they lack ability, but because they hesitate too long trying to be fair, liked, or understood. Power does not wait for comfort. It moves forward with or without you. The ruthless man is not emotional in his execution. He is precise, and he understands that every delay gives advantage to someone else. In real environments, people test limits constantly. They push boundaries to see what they can get away with. And if there is no resistance, they keep pushing further. Machiavelli would describe this as the natural behavior of power dynamics, where space is always taken unless it is defended. A man who cannot set boundaries clearly will always find himself being controlled by those who can. This is why ruthlessness is often misunderstood, because it is actually discipline under pressure, not emotional aggression. It is the ability to say no without explaining yourself into weakness, to make decisions without seeking approval, and to act when action is required instead of when it feels comfortable. Power respects consistency more than emotion, and once people see that your standards do not shift based on pressure, they begin to adjust their behavior around you. This is how influence is built, not through constant negotiation, but through clear positioning. Machiavelli also teaches that a man who tries to please everyone ends up controlling nothing, because he sacrifices authority for acceptance. In contrast, a man who understands when to be firm earns a different kind of attention, one that is based on awareness of his limits and consequences. This does not mean becoming reckless or ignoring humanity, but it does mean understanding that not every situation deserves softness. Some situations require structure, and structure only exists when something is enforced. Many men confuse being understanding with being passive, and that confusion leads to loss of respect in both personal and professional environments. The ruthless mindset removes that confusion by focusing on outcomes rather than approval. It forces clarity in communication, speed in decisions, and strength in boundaries. Over time, this creates a reputation, and reputation is a form of power that works even when you are not present. Machiavelli would argue that once reputation is established, half the battles are already won before they begin, because people adjust their approach before testing you. That is the real advantage of controlled ruthlessness. It shapes perception before action is even required. And in a world driven by perception and leverage, that is a decisive edge. Predictability is one of the fastest ways a man loses power, because once people can correctly guess how you will respond, they no longer need to respect you to deal with you. Machiavelli understood that control in any environment is not only about strength, but about uncertainty. When your behavior becomes too consistent in the wrong way, people begin to map you. They learn your limits, your emotional reactions, and your patterns of decision-making. Once that map is clear, they can manipulate outcomes without direct confrontation. This is why predictable men are often the most exploited, even when they are intelligent or capable. In relationships, in work, and in social circles, people constantly test for reactions. They push slightly to see if you bend. They withdraw to see if you chase. They delay to see if you panic. If your response is always the same, they gain leverage over your psychology. Machiavelli's teaching here is not about becoming chaotic or unstable, but about becoming unreadable in situations where control matters. A man who reacts emotionally every time is easy to steer, because his emotions become a steering wheel for others. If people know exactly what will trigger anger, fear, or compliance in you, they can control the direction of your actions without needing authority over you. This is the hidden layer of power dynamics that most people ignore. Power is not only in what you do, but in what others expect you to do next. When expectations become fixed, freedom disappears. A man who is predictable loses negotiation power because his outcomes are already assumed before discussion begins. Machiavelli would describe this as voluntary surrender of advantage, because you are revealing your hand before the game is played. The stronger position is controlled unpredictability, where your values remain stable, but your reactions are not easily anticipated. This does not mean being fake or inconsistent in principle, but being strategic in expression. For example, not reacting immediately to pressure creates uncertainty. Taking time before responding creates tension. Choosing silence instead of over-explaining creates authority. These are not emotional tricks. They are structural advantages in human behavior. Men who fail to understand this often become reactive instead of deliberate, and reactive men always lose control of timing. Timing is where power lives. If others can force your timing, they control your decisions. Machiavelli's deeper lesson is that predictability is not about routine, it is about psychological accessibility. If people can access your emotional responses too easily, they begin to operate you like a system. Once that happens, respect declines because people only respect what they cannot fully control. A man who is too easy to read becomes too easy to bypass. That is why powerful individuals often speak less, reveal less, and act only when necessary. They are not confused, they are calculating space. The less others understand your next move, the more carefully they must treat your presence. This is how psychological leverage is created without force. Over time, unpredictability builds reputation, and reputation shapes behavior around you, even before interaction happens. Machiavelli would argue that this is one of the quietest forms of dominance, because you are not forcing control, you are shaping uncertainty, and uncertainty makes others cautious. In that caution, you gain room to decide without interference. In relationships, Machiavelli's lesson on control over morality becomes very clear, because emotions often compete directly with power and stability. Imagine a man in a relationship with a woman who constantly tests boundaries, not always out of malice, but out of curiosity, emotion, or insecurity. She may push, withdraw, demand attention, or create emotional tension to see how much control she has over his reactions. If the man responds purely based on morality or fairness every single time, always trying to be the good partner, always trying to avoid conflict, he slowly loses authority in the relationship dynamic. Machiavelli would not say to abandon care or respect, but he would say that survival of respect requires structure, not just emotion. In this scenario, the man who always tries to be morally right may start explaining himself too much, over-apologizing, or accepting behavior that slowly lowers his own standards just to keep peace. At first it looks like harmony, but over time it creates imbalance. The woman begins to feel that there are no consequences for her actions, and the man begins to feel internal frustration because he is giving fairness but not receiving respect. This is where control over morality becomes important. Machiavelli teaches that in any power dynamic, even romantic ones, outcomes matter more than intentions. If your moral consistency leads to your own emotional decline, then it is no longer serving you as a man in that situation. For example, if she crosses a clear boundary, and instead of addressing it firmly, he chooses silence just to avoid being seen as harsh, he is not maintaining peace, he is avoiding necessary structure. Over time, this creates resentment and confusion. The relationship becomes emotionally unstable because one side is leading with feeling and the other is refusing to lead with decision. Machiavelli would argue that leadership in any bond requires clarity, not constant compromise of self. A man like David in a relationship with a partner like Sarah might notice that every time he gives in too easily, the dynamic shifts slightly. She does not lose respect intentionally, but naturally, because consistency of boundaries defines how people perceive strength. When David starts choosing long-term stability over momentary emotional comfort, even if it means saying no, Even if it means creating temporary discomfort, the dynamic begins to reset. Sarah starts to understand that her actions have weight, not because he is aggressive, but because he is no longer fully guided by emotional pressure. This is where Machiavellian control over morality comes into play. It is not about being cold or unloving, but about understanding that love without structure collapses into imbalance. Many men make the mistake of believing that being morally soft will create lasting love, but Machiavelli would argue that unchecked softness creates instability. A man must sometimes choose what strengthens the relationship long-term over what feels emotionally easier in the moment. This can mean holding boundaries even when it creates tension, refusing to chase emotional chaos, or stepping back when respect is being tested. In doing so, he is not abandoning morality. He is prioritizing survival of the relationship structure itself. Because without structure, even love becomes unstable and eventually loses direction. The reality of dominance in relationships is not about shouting louder, loving less, or trying to control someone through force. Machiavelli would frame it in a much colder and clearer way. Dominance is about positioning, awareness, and consequence. Imagine a man in a relationship with a woman who is emotionally expressive and sometimes unpredictable in her behavior. She does not necessarily want to destroy the relationship, but she tests it through emotion, silence, attention shifts, and small boundary challenges. The man who does not understand dominance will respond emotionally every time, trying to fix everything immediately, trying to restore peace at any cost, and slowly placing himself in a position where he is reacting instead of leading. Over time, this creates imbalance. The woman may not even consciously realize it, but she begins to feel that she is setting the emotional tone of the relationship, while he is simply following it. Machiavelli would say that this is not stability, it is quiet surrender of control. Now contrast that with a man who understands dominance in the Machiavellian sense. In a relationship with someone like Sarah, when tension arises, he does not rush to over-explain himself or panic to restore emotional comfort. Instead, he observes, he responds with clarity, and he does not allow emotional pressure to override his standards. If Sarah becomes distant or emotionally reactive, he does not chase in desperation, because he understands that chasing from insecurity reduces his position. Instead, he remains steady, and this steadiness changes the dynamic. She begins to realize that his presence is not dependent on emotional turbulence. That creates a different kind of respect, not forced, but formed through awareness. Dominance here is not about controlling Sarah's behavior, but about controlling his own emotional position within the relationship so that he is not easily pulled off balance. Machiavelli would argue that power is shown in who adjusts whom. If Sarah's moods constantly force David to change his decisions, then Sarah is indirectly leading the emotional structure. But if David remains consistent, calm, and selective in his reactions, then the structure of the relationship begins to align around him instead. This does not mean he ignores her or becomes distant, but that he chooses when to engage and when not to be pulled into unnecessary emotional cycles. Dominance is also reflected in decision-making. When a man is too available, too reactive, and too afraid of discomfort, he loses influence because there is no weight behind his presence. But when he understands timing, when to speak, when to step back, when to reinforce boundaries, he begins to shape the emotional environment instead of being shaped by it. Machiavelli would say this is the difference between being inside the relationship and steering the relationship. In the example of David and Sarah, dominance is not about superiority. It is about control of self in a way that prevents external emotions from dictating internal decisions. The strongest men in relationships are not the ones who dominate through fear, but the ones who remain unshaken under pressure. Because in the end, dominance is not about what you do to the other person. It is about what the situation cannot make you do. And that is where real power exists, in stability under emotional pressure, in clarity under confusion, and in control when everything around you tries to pull you off center. Machiavelli's darkest lesson about power is simple. The world does not reward fairness, it rewards control. Those who learn to act with clarity, discipline, and strategic ruthlessness gain advantage over those who depend on emotions or morality alone. In relationships, business, and life, dominance comes from understanding timing, boundaries, and consequence. If you are predictable, overly fair, or easily influenced by pressure, you will be managed by those who are not. Power belongs to those who adapt, decide quickly, and protect their position without hesitation. In the end, you either understand power or you become controlled by it.